Veterans of the Mountain Legion, with their comrades in arms, were there to safeguard the city. But soon, the men of Old Ulster were on the move yet again. With muskets slung and canteens rattling, the men traversed over mountains and along stony roads on one of the longest marches to date. They forded the Shenandoah River with water up to their waists and soon found themselves at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, where a large campaign was being organized. With Lincoln's nod of approval, General Grant appointed the fiery 33-year-old General Phil Sheridan to command the new army of the Shenandoah. His promise was to devastate the valley and leave it a barren waste with nothing but their eyes to weep with. Sheridan concluded that when finished, the valley from Winchester to Stanton will have but little in it for man or beast. On August 10th, 1864, General Sheridan briskly marched the 156th and his army south toward his first target, Winchester. After weeks of skirmishing with the enemy, neither side was ready to bring on a general engagement. However, on Monday, September 19th, Sheridan saw an opportunity to strike first. Colonel Jacob Sharp, commanding the brigade, ordered the men of the 156th to post in a thick belt of woods on the extreme left. There, Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Neefy soon dismounted his horse and gave the command for the Mountain Legion to form a line of battle. Around 11:30, after hours of incessant skirmishing and artillery fire, the atmosphere was stifling and hazy. A mysterious rider approached the line of the 156. It was soon realized the rider was a member of Colonel Sharp's staff. Upon arrival, he saluted Lieutenant Colonel Neefy and uttered, "Colonel, you have the post of honor. You are the battalion of direction. You will advance." The brass bugle sounded. Neefy, with sword in hand, ordered the men to push forward into an open field about 500 yards wide. Confederate artillery roared in the distance, howling projectiles into their direction, kicking up dirt and debris all around them. The constant barrage and crossfire forced the 156 to oblique far to the left, disconnecting them with the rest of the brigade. In a minute's time, the order sounded, "Charge at the double quick," and the regiment rapidly advanced with furious yells. They pushed Confederate sharpshooters through the open field and into the west woods before halting a moment to reform their line. After regrouping, the men advanced down a slope and abruptly bore witness to the Confederate battle flag waving 30 yards to their front. A thunderous volley instantly erupted from two lines of Confederate infantry who were well concealed behind a rail fence. Scores of men fell in piles. Peter Elting, captain and company, described the scene. "To see the men lie wounded and dying all around you, and others still falling, is indeed terrible." Lieutenant Colonel Neefy ordered the men to lie down and return fire. However, Confederate pressure was too strong, and the men were forced to fall back. Officers of the Mountain Legion displayed lion's courage while attempting to rally their men. Captain Johannes Lefebvre, captain in Company E, withdrew his sword and thrusted it toward the sky. After grasping one of the colors himself, Captain Lefebvre courageously shouted, "We will rally around the flag, boys. We will rally once again." The men firmly stood their ground and opened fire on the enemy, but were soon overwhelmed and forced to fall back again. Now concealed in a narrow strip of woods, the Mountain Legion aggressively returned fire, checking the enemy's advance. As Confederate troops started to waver, Lieutenant Colonel Neefy seized the opportunity and ordered the men to charge. The rebels were now in disorder. After driving the enemy back through the west woods and regaining most of the ground they had previously lost, the 156 gave 3 rousing cheers. However, the momentum had stalled as the Mountain Legion were rapidly confronted with Confederate reinforcements. Realizing there was no support to their left, their right, or rear, Lieutenant Colonel Neefy ordered the regiment to lie down. The desperate fighting in the west woods sounded as if every tree was falling down and that a terrific firestorm was raging. Confederates poured musketry and shell, canister over and into the ranks of the 156. The men would lie on their backs, reload, rise to one knee, aim, fire, and repeat. The regiment sustained head, shoulder, and chest wounds during the frantic fight. Officers of the regiment literally crawled together on all fours under severe fire, discussing the defenseless situation. Without infantry support, all hope seemed to be lost. Soon a messenger arrived with unfortunate news. Colonel Jacob Sharp had been seriously wounded and taken off the field, placing Neefe in command of the brigade. After informing Captain James J. Hoyt that he was now in control of the regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Neefe hastily mounted his horse, dug his spurs in, and rode toward the rear to regroup his now shattered brigade. With each side delivering punishing blows and no ground being won, the battle had become a stalemate for the 156. Anticipating a charge from the enemy at any moment, the men began to conserve their ammunition. Suddenly, to their surprise, they noticed multiple columns of soldiers in blue marching in magnificent style toward the enemy's left flank. The tide of the battle had swung in their favor. With renewed confidence, the Mount Legion prepared to join the final attack. The men were lying flat, hugging the earth, when Captain Hoyt ordered the regiment to quickly rise. However, many in Captain Lefebvre's company surprisingly did not follow the order. When he called to his men to rise, he discovered to his horror that nearly half were killed or severely wounded. He was literally giving orders to a breastwork of dead men. Captain Hoyt shouted, "Forward!" and the remnants of the 156 rushed over the scores of dead and wounded soldiers. Under the direct command of Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Neefe, the advance of the Mountain Legion, along with the entire brigade, was achieved with gallant style. The firing rapidly intensified, but after losing 2 color bearers, the men were determined to win the day. The rebels were driven from their entrenchments, and the 156 captured many Confederate prisoners as they scattered in retreat. Captain Elting summarized in his own words, "The day was ours, and the sun soon set, leaving us in possession of the battlefield and rejoicing over a splendid victory." The 156 suffered 29 killed and 82 wounded, their most brutal fighting to date. But unfortunately, there would be more bloodshed in the days and weeks to come. Early the next day, the brass bugle sounded reveille, and by 5 a.m., the men of the Mount Legion were on the move yet again. Lieutenant Colonel Neefe rejoined the regiment as Colonel Daniel McCauley assumed command of the brigade. Colonel Jacob Sharp was sent north to McClellan Hospital in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to recover from his wound. The 156, now numbering 200, shouldered their muskets and marched to Strasburg in pursuit of the retreating enemy. Large clouds of dust hung over the roads as the men marched 20 miles to the outskirts of town. As the regiment approached, a mysterious hill menaced their advance. Suddenly, a white cloud of smoke projected from the heights beyond. Seconds later, the delayed boom of artillery fire choked the air. Confederates would entrench themselves on this frightening piece of ground known as Fisher's Hill. On Thursday, September 22nd, after securing the town of Strasburg the day before, General Sheridan ordered the 156th and 19th Corps to move into position on the extreme left of the Union line. Directly to their front were a series of rifle pits, which were placed on a small ridge directly below the heights at Fisher's Hill. These rifle pits were occupied by Confederate sharpshooters who were cracking rounds at them all morning. Abraham Vradenberg, corporal in Company A, observed Colonel McCauley mounted on his horse nearby, who was almost shot in the face. Luckily, the round went through the brim of his hat. Vradenberg noted to McCauley, "Colonel, a sharpshooter's got a line on you." He replied, "That was quite close. I better move to some other place." By 7 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Neefe detailed the 156 to replace their rifle muskets with picks and shovels to help fortify their position. For hours, the men labored, digging defensive breastworks supporting the Union line. While under fire from Confederate sharpshooters, General Sheridan realized the rifle pits must be taken. He then ordered 2 guns of artillery to actively shell the enemy position directly to their front. By 12 noon, with rebel sharpshooters suppressed, all firing ceased, leaving behind trails of smoke hazing the field and the small ridge beyond. At this time, the 128th New York deployed as skirmishers to attack the Confederate rifle pits. They advanced at the double quick and soon drove the sharpshooters from their position. While observing the attack, Lieutenant Colonel Neefy pointed to the hill beyond and ordered Captain Hoyt to fortify it. A work detail consisting of 5 companies rushed forward with picks, shovels, and rails. Under a heavy fire of artillery and musketry, the Mountain Legion quickly began digging. They threw up strong defenses, connecting rifle pits into one long continuous trench. During the hectic firefight, the commanding general himself, Phil Sheridan, rode to the front to assess the situation. Just before reaching the top of the ridge, with bullets flying all around him, Sheridan quickly dismounted his horse and crawled on all fours up to the skirmish line. Suddenly, a thunderous howl of an incoming projectile blasted into the ridge within a foot of Sheridan's head, completely covering him with dirt and debris. All who witnessed this terrifying scene assumed he was horribly wounded. However, Sheridan rolled over onto his side completely unharmed and removed the dirt and debris out of his ear and neck. Around 5 a.m., the sound of cheers and the rattle of musketry was heard on the far right, prompting the 19th Corps to join the attack. General Sheridan quickly mounted his horse, waved his hat overhead, and signaled for the entire army to push forward. Lieutenant Colonel Neefy ordered the work detail to return to their original position, collect their rifles, and join the general advance. The Mountain Legion now stood shoulder to shoulder with arms at the ready, colors to the front. On the double quick, they proceeded down the steep side of a ravine and up the nearly inaccessible side of Fisher's Hill. The 156 successfully drove the enemy from their entrenchments, capturing many prisoners and upwards of 20 pieces of artillery. The fighting continued throughout the night and well into the following morning before the exhausted regiment finally halted and went into camp. After the Battle of Fisher's Hill, 156 suffered 1 killed and 3 wounded. At this point in the war, the Confederate Army in the Shenandoah Valley were demoralized and routed. Generals Grant and Sheridan believed that rebel forces, led by General Jubal Early, had little to no fight left in them. After pursuing the retreating enemy for days, Sheridan's supply wagons became spread out, leaving them vulnerable to attack. He would redeploy his army north to a defensive position along the heights near Cedar Creek to connect his supply convoy and communication lines. However, along the way, General Sheridan implemented a cruel and ruthless style of unconventional warfare. Burn the barns, destroy the bridges and railroad tracks, kill the livestock, and seize the grain and wheat. The objective was to destroy the Shenandoah Valley, leaving a barren wasteland with nothing left for the enemy to subsist on. Many Union cavalrymen took personal liberties during the chaotic disorder by looting civilian property before torching their homesteads. This would become known as the burning. After the complete devastation of the Shenandoah Valley and with triumphant victories at 3rd Winchester and Fisher's Hill, Generals Grant and Sheridan both believed this signified the end of the Valley Campaign of 1864. Shortly before daybreak, on the cold morning of October 19th, Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Neefy, acting division officer of the day, rode through the dreary darkness on his faithful gray horse and dismounted. Standing with his hand on the saddle, Neefy inquired from a nearby soldier on the picket line if any Confederate movement had been reported. He informed the soldier to not be alarmed by any firing that might be heard, as the division was to scout for the enemy at daybreak. Neefy barely finished his statement when the rattle of musketry burst forth, breaking the stillness of the gloomy morning. The demonic-sounding rebel yell of the rapidly approaching enemy engulfed the air, signaling the dawn of another day of bloodshed. Deeply alarmed, Neefy threw himself into the saddle and hastily rode toward the direction of the firing. The day was just beginning to dawn over the well-fortified entrenchments on the heights overlooking Cedar Creek. The rising sun pierced through the dense morning fog as the Mountain Legion began to sip their first cup of coffee. While preparing for the morning reconnaissance, startling sounds of gunfire, discharges of artillery, and desperate screaming could be heard in the distance. At this time, 18-year-old Color Corporal Charles Green uncased the precious regimental flag, now tattered and stained with the blood of Ulster County's finest. As the Mountain Legion began to assemble, scores of disoriented soldiers, many without shoes or guns, burst through the thick fog, frantically running into their ranks. While anticipating the oncoming attack, and after discovering that his left flank was completely exposed, Colonel Daniel Macaulay, commanding the brigade, hastily deployed the 156th and 176th across the Valley Pike to confront the Confederate surge. Captain James J. Hoyt, now commanding the regiment, ordered the men to hold their fire until they could distinctly see the enemy. Standing in a long battle line, the Mountain Legion quickly drew their ramrods and began to load their rifle muskets. Bullets started to zip into the ranks from the unseen enemy, wounding several men. As the rebel yell intensified, they suddenly observed 150 yards to their front, scores of gray-clad rebel soldiers unveiled through the cloudy abyss. A murderous fire again poured into the 156th, to which they replied with a roaring volley of their own. While cheering on his men, Captain Hoyt fell to the ground seriously wounded, blood pouring from his limp arm. After being pulled to safety, Captain Alfred Cooley took command of the frantic situation. The 1st Rhode Island Battery, off to their left, sent deadly canister fire into the rapidly advancing foe, vibrating the earth beneath their feet. However, nothing could halt the enemy's swift advance. Suddenly, Confederates from the 53rd Georgia were upon the men of the 156th like a swarm of deadly bees. After successfully planting the rebel battle flag upon the Union entrenchments, brutal hand-to-hand combat ensued as men of the Mountain Legion fought with fists and clubbed rifles. Color Corporal Green fell during the melee, subsequently dropping to the ground the precious regimental colors. The flag fell lifelessly to the dirt. 39-year-old Philip Decker, Sergeant in Company E from the town of Shawangunk, burst forward to rescue their beloved flag. With flag in one hand and musket in the other, Decker was rushed by 2 Confederate soldiers. As one rebel was quickly killed, the other hastily grabbed the flagstaff. Together, one man from New York and the other from Georgia tussled back and forth, each man trying to seize the flag from the other. Behind Decker, Captain Johannes Lefebvre and Sergeant Church Donaldson both fell mortally wounded. While cheering on his brigade further to the rear, Colonel Macaulay toppled from his mount with a severe chest wound, leaving the leadership of the brigade to the ever-present Alfred Neafy, who was now riding toward the scene. Desperation had reached its pinnacle as the 156th began to fall back. Sergeant Decker quickly stripped the flag from its staff, leaving the rebel soldier with only the pole in his possession. As he began to retreat with the colors, a painful thump slammed into his right elbow. Decker began to bleed profusely, but was determined to cradle the flag to safety. At this point, the Mountain Legion were in full retreat. Upwards of 40 men were taken prisoner. The men scattered in every direction. After heavy blood loss and running out of energy, Decker fell on the field, the symbol of Ulster County in his loving grasp. With Confederates in hot pursuit, Captain Cooley, who was nearby, hurried over to Decker and retrieved the bloodstained flag. The 156th, together with the entire army, retreated nearly 2 miles in disarray to a hill outside of Middletown, Virginia. Both demoralized and utterly whipped, they rallied for one final stand. Lieutenant Colonel Neafy, now riding at the head of his fragmented brigade, attempted to check the enemy's advance. One observer of the 38th Massachusetts noted that he stood on that hill, pale with feeling, saying, "Oh, men, for God's sake, for honor's sake, for your country's sake, don't flinch now." To their eternal honor, the men of Neafy's brigade valiantly held their ground. After running for miles, Captain Cooley soon spotted Lieutenant Colonel Neafy, rigid and upright, mounted on his gray horse. After the 2 locked eyes, Cooley made his way to the brigade commanding officer and handed him the cherished regimental flag. Neafy strapped the blood-tattered remnant to his saddle and rode off with the colors safely secure from any harm. After a frantic 20-mile ride from his Winchester headquarters, General Phil Sheridan arrived on the field, reinvigorating his troops in Union blue. Sheridan dispatched a young lieutenant toward the direction of Neefe's brigade. Upon arrival, the young lieutenant saluted and stated to Colonel Neefe, "General Sheridan's compliments. At 3:15, you will fix bayonets, advance on the enemy, and drive them beyond Cedar Creek." As ordered, Neefe promptly advanced his blended brigade and with vivacious cheers swept the field at the double quick. After a brief yet gallant resistance, the Confederate army broke into a wild, panic-stricken retreat, resulting in a glorious and absolute victory for General Sheridan and his resilient army. When evening roll call was sounded, the 156th sustained 17 killed, 29 wounded, 41 prisoner, and 5 missing. Since August of 1864, after the start of Sheridan's Valley Campaign, in just 2 short months following 3 decisive battles, the 156 sustained 207 casualties. In 1862, when the regiment sailed for the theater of war, they had just over 800 men. By the end of 1864, only 92 remained. After the triumphant Valley Campaign, the men of the 156 were transferred to the all-too-familiar climate of the Deep South. By January of 1865, the Mountain Legion arrived in Savannah, Georgia, and went to work performing garrison duty within the city. On April 9, 1865, they would hear the cheerful news that the Army of Northern Virginia, under the command of General Robert E. Lee, surrendered. Less than a week later, they would be informed of shocking news. The President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, was assassinated. The year of 1865 was a tidal wave of emotions. The war had been won, the president murdered, and the regiment to now disband and muster out of service in October of 1865. The men would return home. For many, it was their first time seeing loved ones in 3 years. Life would change. It would be very different. Some would stay home with hopes of picking up where they left off. Others would move out west or down south to start a whole new life. Alfred Neefe, now Brevet Brigadier General, summed up 1865 with his most usual eloquence. This is in his own words. "We are apt to forget that we are living in a grand and awful time, that we are fighting the greatest battle for human freedom and the rights of man that the world ever withheld. Already the thick clouds are beginning to break away and the clear sky can be seen on the horizon. It may cloud up again, but the fury of the storm has passed, and the bright sun of peace will soon shine on our free and happy country." 156.